Sad to say, this week's guest is me. 100 episodes. I think I read somewhere that fewer than 4% of all podcasts get to 100 episodes. So a little bit of rare territory. Now, I have done other podcasts in my past, so this is not my first podcast. I would say probably potentially my third podcast. The other ones did not get to 100 episodes, although I would say my first podcast that I did, which was not in the same way, just they were audio recordings. I wasn't even submitting them to any other platform. I think I did about 58 of them, but very proud to be able to have completed 100 episodes, and really just wanted to take this time to reflect a little bit about the journey that it's been and what I think it's done, not only for my understanding of Canadian education and Canadian leaders, but hopefully for you as well. I wanted to share a few highlights and for me, a little bit of a chance to take a trip down memory lane. I've been doing this for just about 4 years now. And so I'd love to just give you an overview of what this looks like across Canada, maybe highlighting a few specific categories, if you will, of these podcasts. But again, I think I can't just be more thankful or more grateful for the time that people have given me. And I think what's happened over these 100 episodes is we painted a very awesome picture of what's great about Canadian education and Canadian leaders. So let's take a moment just to dive into some of these examples. So you're over here on my YouTube channel. What I've done is just tried to wrap out, like, what do we have for a breakdown in terms of this Canadian-wide look. And so you can see I have 31 of my episodes have been from folks in Ontario. Not surprisingly, that's our biggest province. And a lot of these people, though, there are a number of folks who are not specifically educators within Ontario, but are their home bases in Ontario, and they actually serve communities and people all across Canada. And so that's why it's also skewed a little bit larger to them. But I would say this about what I would say about Ontario leaders and Ontario educators is they have probably the biggest challenge in terms of navigating the politics of education, especially of late. So Ontario education has been a lot more in the news lately, and with government sort of interventions, whether it was a cell phone policy or looking at breaking up trustees and other sort of financial challenges that have been faced, they have to deal with this a lot. So many of those leaders are dealing with that on a daily basis, and the degree to which they navigate that has been, I think, pretty amazing. And at the same time, when I think about the diversity within that province, I think it speaks well to that province as a whole. Next on that list is British Columbia, and 17 podcasts with people from British Columbia. And I have a very, very soft spot in my heart for British Columbia. Probably done the bulk of my work outside of my tenure here in Saskatchewan, but since 2012 have done the bulk of my work in British Columbia and have really developed some pretty strong relationships with not only those districts, but certainly the leaders within that province. And many of these people are longtime people that I've known and really, I think, speak to innovation. I would probably use as the way to describe British Columbia education. And the other thing I would say is probably the best sense of community. And even with a province as vast as it is, there is a clear commitment on behalf of all of these educators to serve not just their districts, but the entire province. And that's probably true. You could maybe argue that's true in other provinces, but it certainly manifests, I think, in British Columbia, maybe more than other provinces. So third, probably in line again with population, is Alberta. And Alberta, I would probably say many of these people are as much, I would say, most easy to connect with and most down to earth. That is a real sense of ownership at that local level. And why I say that is because many of these people, and I think about somebody like Chris Smeaton, who I've known for a decade or longer, over his years, and Chris represents, I think, so many of the folks in Alberta, is that they will focus on their community and doing what's right for their community. That sort of supersedes many of the things, whether it's the ministry things. So there's often a conflict with ministry because of that, because that's their priority. So that's been clear that local community takes precedence, I would say. Mike McMahon being another one of those examples who just sort of, that's what he thinks about first. And if that means ruffling feathers outside of his division, that's okay. So very much a focus on the local communities as a priority. So next on the list, Manitoba. And it was actually Donna Miller-Fry, who previously was in Manitoba, which I'll get to that theme in a moment, who said there's something about the way Manitoba education is structured. And yes, she was talking about the people. And of course, the people are what really make it. But there is something she was hinting at around the structure of Manitoba education. And they are the only province who actually still allows for local taxation, right? Mill rates to be set at the local level, which is controversial in itself. And I actually have a separate episode dedicated to that theme with some folks from Alberta and Manitoba. I don't know if that's it. I don't know what the structure is, but again, I think there is something really unique about the leadership and Manitoba education in general. So that's one I'm still prodding at to try to surface more. I will say this though, Matt Henderson and Sandra Herbst both used the word love in their episodes, and there were a couple others. They weren't the only ones, of course, but those are two specific Manitoba superintendents who use that framing. So I don't know. Maybe it's about love. Well, I don't know. After that is my actual home province of Saskatchewan, where I have 8 episodes from there. And again, as I tell people all the time, Saskatchewan, oddly enough, is the place I have done the least amount of work in my sort of post-district career. And so I'm as curious as anybody to learn about what's happening in Saskatchewan education. And again, I think, a big impact in Saskatchewan that is somewhat unique is the rural component, which although Manitoba and Saskatchewan are very similar in terms of size of population, Manitoba is somewhat different in that the majority of their folks are in the Winnipeg region, whereas we are in Saskatchewan a little bit more spread out. And so that does, I think, plays into it. But a couple of really special episodes that I'll talk about later from my Saskatchewan folks. After that, oddly enough, my next most number of episodes comes out of Northwest Territories. So the Northwest Territories is certainly a new place. I've never been before. It looks like I will have a chance to go there in February, thanks to Donna Miller-Fry, who's one of the guests. But this was probably my biggest area of learning in terms of just understanding the North. There's a real culture there, a real identity of what that means to be a Northern Canadian, and all of that land, Indigenous cultures, and all of those things that really impact the way education looks in that part of our great country. And so this has been just a tremendous opportunity for me to better understand the impact of the North, those that serve in the North. A number of these folks, though, interestingly enough, have since moved from there, were there for a while, and have moved back to the South, as they refer to the rest of us. That's such an odd thing, but to call any part of Canada South. But yeah, this is a really powerful place of learning. And so next we go from 5 to, now we're getting into the smaller numbers. We head over to Quebec, which obviously is not a small province, but the English portion of Quebec is somewhat of a unique part of our education system. And this is, again, another area of learning, understanding the dynamics between, and I have had some of this understanding between the Francophone side of things in Quebec and the English boards in Quebec. And so that there's a real, there's a tension certainly that exists there that's navigated, but a real pride from these boards who probably better than any other boards in Canada have done a tremendous job of creating fully bilingual students. So that's something that they're really proud of, but yet continue to work towards a really challenging dynamic, if you will, in the political sphere in Quebec. Continuing out east, where I have, let's see here, we can go to New Brunswick. Again, only 2 episodes there. one from the ministry with Sarah Rankin. And this was on the heels of knowing that New Brunswick and BC are the only two provinces as of, near the end of 2025 who have actually made any kind of statement and support around AI. And so Sarah has led that charge, and good to hear from her, and Randy, who's again served in a number of different provinces, but is now fully embedded in New Brunswick, and just again learning about that culture. Really, I would say pretty innovative space, and largely due again to their geography. They're very close knit, and there's some real opportunity for their innovation. So appreciate learning about that in New Brunswick. Nova Scotia, again, I only have a couple of people from Nova Scotia, and of course the sort of right now the identifier for Nova Scotia is the fact that they have in the last number of years abandoned the role of trustees, and which is an emerging issue in Ontario for sure, and maybe in other parts of Canada, but they actually have done it. And both of these conversations dealt a little bit with that dynamic and how that's been seen in some ways as positive, because there can be some positive aspects of it, but also what the challenges are when you sort of eliminate that local voice. So just again, a different sort of structure there you see in Nova Scotia, and kind of early days trying to see how this will play out in the future. And then finally, in the last two places, I only have one each. I was able very early on to interview Tracy Below, who is the director of the public school branch of Prince Edward Island. They have obviously one single school board that's the entire province, and Tracy was somewhat of a reluctant leader taking on this role, and you can hear in her episode just how she thought about needed that sort of support to get there, but she got it in the end, and is continuing to lead in that province. And you can imagine a place like PEI has some interesting dynamics to it as well. One of our most beautiful provinces, no doubt. Small but mighty, as they like to say. And finally, my most recent guests from Newfoundland. I got a bit of a 2-for-1 here. So while only one episode, Stephen and Ryan, who serve as directors of different pockets. And so you can think of those, I guess, as superintendents, if you will, but obviously that's not their title. And again, a shift, or more recent shift in this province to move to a single school board. But we talked about that a little bit, but I guess what I loved about this conversation was the way in which they have been embracing Ted Lasso as a way of framing their professional learning. So as much as that feels like I've covered the entire country, I still have a gap. None of it. And the Yukon, I do not have any guests from those two territories. So if you're listening to this and you know somebody, because I don't think I know anybody from those two territories, but maybe somebody listening can reach out, connect with somebody. Maybe you're from those places and say, hey, I'd like to be a guest. Just ping me. We can make something happen. What I also might want to say is just I maybe talk a little bit about some of the other special episodes I've had. So I've had I think 4 episodes where I've had multiple guests on. So the first one I did was with the EdTech Posse, and why that is very significant is because those gentlemen here in Saskatchewan, Rick Schweer, Rob Wall, Alec Koros, part of that initial podcasting group that I belong to. And so we started podcasting in 2007, if you can believe it. Podcasting as people know it today was very different. There was no Spotify, there was no Apple Podcasts, those kind of things. And so it was great to reconnect with those folks and talk about sort of the early days. And in many respects, podcasting hasn't really changed that much. It's still this idea of, in this format anyways, people having conversations. And it was great to reconnect, and you'll get a kind of a sense of what we used to do. Some other sort of joint ones have been around particular themes. So I did a Gen AI, Women in Gen AI, with Kirsten Thomas, Katrina Gadet, and Whitney McKinley, who are definitely early adopters in the space, and kind of hearing from them, both the way they're leading it in their respective boards, but also just sort of their whole, the role of women in this work, which is really powerful. I did another one, as I mentioned before, on rural education. And, those are kind of born out of people saying, hey, we should talk about this. And so was Ted Franson, who reached out and said, I think this would be a really interesting conversation. And so between Ted, Shelley, and Peter Barron, the three of them kind of talked about how rural education has to be understood differently. And so, yes, there is a rural education conference every year, and a few other aspects of this that I think is really a dynamic that really needs to be understood. So in the same way that you might not live in the North, but you need to understand it. You might not be working in rural Canada, but you should understand it. I did another one, sort of the early Gen AI district level work with Tom D'Amico and Chris Kennedy. Again, the two of them kind of leading this work in terms of the district approach. And I've had the other sort of joint one was with Christy Blakeway and Sandeep from Surrey, who have started a new podcast, Leading Voices in Education, which I highly recommend. They have some amazing guests. Other sort of broad categories I've had is a number of people from higher education. So beginning with, I just call out Cameron Hausman, who was my very first guest. I heard him speak at a conference, and he, I guess, almost sort of helped me think about, hey, we need to highlight these people in this work. Another subsection of these provincial visits is with people from higher education. So, the likes of Alec Horace, Bonnie Stewart, Dave Cormier, Sarush Sabagan, and Dr. Cameron Hausman from the University of Manitoba, who was my first guest. And I really, again, I'm grateful for him for taking a chance on me. I had no podcast. I had nothing to reference him. I'd met him at a conference, and I think it was maybe his presentation around his research on principles and mental health that I just thought, well, more people need to know about that. And so that was kind of where this began. So that's been an interesting, the higher ed perspective along my journey. Darren McKee and Dr. Brad Baker, both Indigenous educators who I just have come to respect so much over the years and have really been a big part of my own learning journey in terms of truth and reconciliation and their work. And so really, really great content from both of them. I've had a few, again, a number of guests along the way. I have worked in different provinces. And so because we're talking about Canadian leadership, I'm always curious to have them compare as best they can, one province to another and sort of the workings of that and what they're finding. And there's always interesting insights they share, and more often than not kind of confirm what I've come to know over the years. And then three special guests in that category, Craig Cantley, Amos Fotchuk, and John Malloy, who talk about another country. So both Amos and John are dual citizens and are now in the US. And so just the comparison between American and Canadian education, I'm always finding fascinating. And Craig is in Japan. And again, longtime British Columbia educator, comparing the Japanese way of doing things versus what the way that things are done and the culture in British Columbia. So I find those conversations really rich. And finally, some of the ones that they're educators, but not maybe in the truest sense. And so there's three that come to mind. One is Steve Boots. I know that's actually not his name, but Steve was actually a YouTuber. He was a teacher, went to become a YouTuber, and now is back in the classroom after a time in that space. And so I just was curious about what that life was like, that transition to that role, and just he has obviously an education lens that he brought to his political kind of content. Again, just understanding how you do that and whatnot. And again, but now I know he's back in a classroom in Saskatchewan. Nora Young might have been my most, achievement in terms of one of my high profile guests. I mean, everybody's sort of high profile in specific circles, but Nora is somebody that I have admired as a podcaster and a journalist for probably 20 years now. And so to be able to reach out to her and her willing to come on and talk about education as best she can. I mean, has been educating Canada through her podcasts and writing and other journalistic pursuits. So that was a real highlight. And finally, my dad, had him on and, as a 93-year-old person who was educated up to grade 8, really probably maybe is in some respects the least qualified to speak, and yet maybe the most important person that I've ever had on the show because of the influence obviously that he's had in my life, but also just everybody on the show has been really, really generous with their time and learning. There are a lot of hours of content here for people to consume and that I've been able to consume over time. And I'm proud of being able to do this and have this sort of record of conversations. But again, more importantly, I think this shines such a good light on Canadian education. And I say this all the time, that I think we're way better than we think we are. And yet I know the nature of the work is to look at the gaps and try to identify those gaps and work towards those parts where we're not that great and we're not that strong. And how do we be more equitable, be more impactful in people's lives? And I mean, we'll never get there because we're people and that's part of the job, but the degree to which these people pursue that daily and really model that is quite outstanding. And so I'm grateful for that. And I hope it can continue this work for maybe another 100 episodes. That would be really cool. So, and the last thing is just a final shout out to Amos Fodchuk, who under the guise of ALP, Advanced Learning Partnership, said, yes, go ahead and spend some time in your day making this content because he sees the value in it. And I think just being able to connect people. We had a conference in Surrey at the beginning of October, and I didn't actually count, but I'm sure 30 to 40 people that are on my podcast were at that event. Some of them as a direct result of building a relationship with online and through our podcasts and connecting them with one another. So very, very proud of that as well. So anyway, thank you all of you for those of you that listen. If you're still even listening to this at the end of this, I have no idea how long this is. I'm trying to make it a little bit shorter, but I just thought for a 100th episode, it would be nice to do a little reflection of where things stand, and just to hear from me kind of as I pull back and look at all of these 100 episodes that have happened over the last couple of years, 4 years, I guess it is, from really the inception. So thank you all for listening and watching, and we'll see you for the next 100 episodes.